Dawn presses against the hills of Djahy, but the light feels muted, swallowed by a haze that clings to the narrow corridor between the mountains and the sea. The air is heavy with heat rising from the stony ground, carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and distant fire. Before the first arrow flies, the battlefield already trembles, not from movement, but from anticipation. Something vast and irreversible is about to begin. Egyptian soldiers stand in disciplined ranks, shields angled, breath slow and controlled. They hear the wind scraping over the dry earth, feel the faint vibration of footsteps approaching from beyond the rising dust. Every man senses the weight of silence before impact, that thin, suspended moment when the world seems to hold its breath. They are the last great army of a fading age, and this narrow strip of land is the line they must hold. Across the haze, another sound grows, irregular at first, then swelling into a steady rhythm. The sea peoples advance, their footsteps merging with the clatter of shields and the rumble of carts behind them. Families, warriors, survivors of fallen kingdoms. A human tide shaped by collapse. Their silhouettes flicker through the dust like waves breaking against unseen rock. For Egypt, this is no ordinary enemy. It is a test of survival, a trial by fire that will decide whether the ancient order endures or is finally swallowed by chaos. A gust of wind cuts through the corridor, lifting sand into spirals that drift across both armies. For a heartbeat, the battlefield blurs, the living caught between the ruined world behind them and the uncertain one ahead. No king can stop what is coming. No treaty can slow it. In 1178 BCE, on the outer edge of the Levant, a place called Djahy, the first great stand is about to be made. This is the story of that stand. This is the Battle of Djahy. Before the armies of Egypt and the Sea Peoples meet at Djahy, the world around them has already begun to collapse. The Late Bronze Age, once defined by its networks of trade, diplomacy, and palace economies, enters a period of accelerating decline. Kingdoms that relied on steady harvests and long-distance exchange now face disruptions they cannot correct. Climate patterns shift, tightening agricultural yields across Anatolia and the Levant. Earthquakes strike coastal regions, damaging ports and storage centers. The interconnected web that supported great powers begins to fray, then tear. The Hittite Empire offers the clearest sign of this unraveling. Once a formidable rival to Egypt, it weakens under the combined strain of famine, internal unrest, and pressure from hostile groups along its borders. Its capital, Hattusa, suffers repeated shortages and eventually loses the ability to coordinate its vast network of vassals. Provinces rebel or act independently, and the empire's military loses the cohesion required to enforce control. When the final blow comes, it is swift. The Hittite world disappears almost as if swallowed by the instability around it. Farther south, the Levant mirrors this collapse. Ugarit, a thriving port city long tied to international trade, records urgent pleas for assistance in its final surviving letters. They speak of enemy ships, of coastal raids, of threats approaching from land and sea. No aid arrives. Ugarit falls in a single catastrophic event that leaves its archives buried beneath rubble. Other cities meet similar fates, some destroyed, others slowly abandoned as populations move in search of safety or sustenance. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean kingdoms face their own disintegration. Palatial centers burn. Regional elites lose the power needed to coordinate labor or defense. Whether their collapse stems from external attack, internal revolt, or cumulative stress, the result is the same. The political landscape fractures into smaller, less stable communities. The large-scale order that once connected the Aegean to the Near East falters. Into this void move groups shaped by displacement. Some flee ruined homelands, others follow leaders who offer security amid uncertainty, and still others take advantage of the weakened defenses around them. They travel in multi-layered formations, blending warriors with families, cart trains with ships. Later traditions call many of them the Sea Peoples, though their identities and origins are diverse. The one constant is motion, southward, through regions unable to resist. Egypt observes these developments with increasing attention. Its own internal pressures exist, economic strain, social unrest, but the kingdom remains fundamentally intact. The Nile still supports agriculture. The bureaucracy still distributes grain. The army still operates under a unified command. Yet Egypt understands the danger. Every fallen city in the Levant removes a buffer. Every migrating group that pushes southward narrows the distance between instability and the Nile Valley. By the time the Sea Peoples approach Djahy, the collapse of the Bronze Age world is no longer a distant narrative. It is a spreading reality, surrounding Egypt on nearly every side. And in this shifting landscape, the battle that awaits will determine whether the last great empire of the age can maintain its footing as the world around it falls. The groups that would one day stand against Egypt at Djahy did not originate from a single land or a single crisis. They emerged from the fragmentation of the late Bronze Age, moving across a world where states weakened faster than they could adapt. To later Egyptian scribes, they became the Sea Peoples, a label that compresses a vast and varied movement into a single phrase. In reality, they were a convergence of peoples displaced by environmental change, political collapse, shifting alliances, and the simple need to survive. Their identities differed widely. The Shurden, recognizable by their round shields and horned helmets, had appeared earlier in Egyptian records as dangerous raiders and sometimes as mercenaries. The Peliset, associated with Aegean-style material culture, carried traditions from regions already destabilized. The Shekelesh, Denyen, and Checker joined the movement with their own histories, shaped by local conditions now swept aside. Archaeology captures these identities only partially, through pottery styles, weapon types, and remnants of clothing, but it reveals patterns of mobility and shared pressure. What drew these groups together was not a common origin, but a common trajectory. Each faced diminishing resources in lands no longer able to support stable communities. Each encountered collapsing powers unable to offer security or trade. As they moved, they blended migration with warfare, a combination that allowed them to sustain themselves in regions where state structures no longer functioned. Women, children, animals, carts, and warriors traveled side by side, creating columns that were part army, part wandering population, and part survival strategy. Their weaponry reflected the broader transitions of the era. Long slashing swords, more versatile than the older stabbing blades, spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Round shields emphasized mobility and offered adequate protection for infantry formations. Helmets of bronze or leather appeared alongside simple cloth wraps. Some warriors wore scale armor, while others fought unarmored but relied on the density of their formations. Their strength did not lie in uniformity, but in adaptability. They could assault fortified settlements weakened by famine, bypass stronger positions, or seize coastal towns that offered new bases of support. As they advanced through the Levant, their presence destabilized regions already strained by drought, famine, and political fragmentation. Some local rulers attempted alliances, hoping to redirect the movement rather than confront it. Others resisted and were overwhelmed. The destruction patterns of this period vary. Some sites show fire and rapid abandonment, others quiet depopulation. But the overall result was the same, a continuous southward pressure that altered the balance of power in every region it touched. For Egypt, early reports described these groups not as organized invaders, but as waves of people reshaping them. Political landscape. Over time, however, the scale of their movement became unmistakable. They did not scatter after each encounter. They pressed forward. Each region they entered contributed new members, displaced locals, defecting warriors, communities seeking protection. What began as multiple small migrations grew into a force capable of challenging the weakened states of the Levant. Their approach to warfare made them especially difficult to stop. Infantry-heavy, mobile, and capable of rapid concentration, they relied on the momentum of advancing communities rather than strict military hierarchy. Their strength lay in pushing forward relentlessly, overwhelming opponents unused to fighting an enemy that carried its entire world with it. By the time they approached Djahy, the Sea Peoples were no longer simply migrants. They had become a decisive force shaped by an age of instability, and their movement south signaled that Egypt, too, would soon be drawn into the struggle defining the end of the Bronze Age. Amid the instability spreading across the Mediterranean, Egypt remained the last major power with its core intact. Its survival rested not on isolation, but on the resilience of a system refined over centuries. The Nile continued to flood with reliable rhythm, supporting agriculture even as neighboring regions struggled with drought. Administrators still recorded harvests, allocated rations, and organized labor. Temples continued to function as economic centers, anchoring society through ritual and redistribution. This stability distinguished Egypt from the kingdoms that had already fallen. Ramses III inherited a throne that understood both the threat and the responsibility of endurance. Though internal tensions and resource strains existed, Egypt retained the institutional strength to respond strategically to external dangers. The pharaoh commanded not only an army, but a state capable of mobilizing supplies, directing intelligence networks, and maintaining fortified positions along its borders. This administrative cohesion allowed Egypt to plan rather than simply react. The Egyptian military remained one of the most disciplined forces of the age. Its infantry formed the backbone of its armies, archers trained to deliver coordinated volleys, spearmen drilled to hold steady under pressure, and shield-bearers positioned to maintain cohesion in the shifting tempo of battle. Yet the hallmark of Egyptian warfare was the chariot corps. Light, maneuverable, and designed for speed, each chariot carried a driver and an archer whose coordination could decide the course of an engagement. Chariots exploited openings, harassed flanks, and delivered rapid strikes that broke enemy formations. Under Ramses III, this force gained renewed importance. He anticipated that the threats approaching from the north would not resemble earlier imperial rivals. The Sea Peoples relied heavily on infantry assaults, dense, aggressive, momentum-driven. Against such opponents, mobility and control would matter more than brute force. Ramses ensured that chariot divisions were supplied, rested, and ready to act as the decisive element on a battlefield chosen to limit the enemy's advantages. Egypt's defensive preparations extended far beyond its armies. Supply depots were stocked along northern routes, ensuring that troops could sustain prolonged operations away from the Nile Valley. Scouts monitored the movements of the Sea Peoples, reporting the locations of seized towns, shifting alliances, and new concentrations of population. These reports allowed Ramses to map the advancing threat and anticipate where a decisive confrontation might occur. Strategically, Egypt could not allow the Sea Peoples to reach the Nile Delta in full strength. The delta's numerous waterways, farming villages, and transport routes were the kingdom's lifeline. A battle fought there would risk catastrophic disruption. Instead, Ramses sought to halt the Sea Peoples in the Levant, where the geography could compress their formations and prevent them from spreading across open ground. Djahy offered precisely that terrain. A narrow corridor shaped by mountains on one side and sea on the other, it forced large forces into predictable paths. Egypt's long-standing presence there, through garrisons, supply stations, and local alliances, provided a foundation for a planned defense. Ramses recognized that if Egypt stood firm at Djahy, the Sea Peoples would be denied the chance to strike deeper into Egyptian territory. By the time Egyptian forces advanced north, the strategy was clear. Meet the Sea Peoples on ground that limited their mobility. Use disciplined infantry to absorb their initial surge, and allow the chariot corps to break their cohesion. It was a plan that relied not on hope, but on the strengths that had allowed Egypt to outlast its rivals. Ramses III prepared for Djahy with the understanding that this battle would determine whether Egypt could remain a functioning empire in a world increasingly defined by collapse. The coming conflict would test not only the army he commanded, but the stability of the kingdom itself. The approach to Djahy unfolded over months, shaped as much by geography as by intention. The Sea Peoples did not move as a single army, but as a broad front of migrating communities, with warriors at the center and families following behind. Their columns stretched across the Levantine routes, pressing southward through regions already weakened by famine, political fragmentation, and the disappearance of older defensive systems. Each step of their progress removed another buffer between them and Egypt. Their movement followed the natural contours of the land. Coastal plains offered access to water and potential harbors. Inland valleys provided temporary shelter and routes toward settlements not yet abandoned. Where resistance emerged, it often lacked the coordination or resources needed to hold firm. Some towns capitulated in hope of preserving what remained. Others attempted to defend themselves, only to fall quickly to an enemy practiced in seizing local advantages. There was no clear front line, only a steady southward drift that reshaped the political landscape. Egyptian scouts tracked this advance with urgency. They gathered intelligence not only on the warriors themselves, but on the entire migrating complex, its size, its supplies, the rhythm of its movement. These scouts saw fields trampled by travelers, storehouses stripped for provisions, and coastal towns repurposed as temporary camps. They reported not a series of isolated incidents, but a consistent pattern, a force that grew as it moved, absorbing displaced populations and moving with the confidence of a group that had overcome every obstacle placed before it. As these reports accumulated, one geographic constant appeared again and again. The sea peoples were funneling toward Djahy. The region's terrain left them little choice. The mountains to the east limited large-scale maneuvering, while the coastline to the west narrowed the passage into a corridor that could not be bypassed without difficulty. For a migrating force dependent on movement and momentum, Djahy was both a gateway and a constraint. Egypt recognized the opportunity. Djahy's geography favored defenders who could hold steady lines and exploit limited avenues of approach. Its ridges, plains, and narrow passes allowed the disciplined Egyptian infantry to anchor their formations, while the firmer ground provided ideal operating conditions for the chariot corps. Ramses III understood that if the sea peoples were to be stopped before reaching the Nile Delta, it would be here, where the land forced their mass into predictable patterns. Egyptian preparations reflected this strategic clarity. Supply depots were stocked along the northern approaches. Units rotated forward to ensure fresh troops reached the front. Officers coordinated staging areas where infantry and chariot divisions could assemble without revealing themselves prematurely. The goal was simple but essential: control the moment and place of engagement. As Egypt advanced into Djahy, signs of the Sea People's passage were unmistakable. Abandoned fields, scattered remnants of temporary encampments, and disrupted local settlements marked the landscape. But these traces also revealed the vulnerabilities of the migrating force. Their momentum required constant access to food and materials. Their formations, while formidable, depended on terrain that allowed them to gather strength and launch broad-based assaults. Djahy denied them this advantage. Here, the terrain compressed them, forcing a confrontation on narrow ground against an opponent prepared for the conditions. By the time both forces neared each other, neither could avoid the battle that would decide whether Egypt remained the last great power of the age or joined the long list of kingdoms lost to the turbulence of its time. The road to Djahy ended not in negotiation or delay, but in the inevitability of conflict. What remained was the battle itself. Dawn rises over Djahy with a muted, colorless light. The land reveals itself slowly, a narrow corridor pressed between rising hills and the long curve of the coastline. The ground is firm and uneven, marked by stones and dry vegetation, a terrain that favors disciplined formations over broad, sweeping movements. It is here, on this compressed stage, that two forces converge. One a migrating tide shaped by the collapse of the age, the other the last organized empire capable of resisting it. The Sea Peoples arrive first. Their column stretches far along the road, a mix of hardened warriors, families, carts, and supply clusters. This is not a conventional army. It is a population on the move, and its momentum sustains it. At the front stand the fighting men, infantry bearing round shields, long slashing swords, and helmets of bronze or leather. Their experience comes not from drills, but from the harsh logic of survival in a fragmented world. They advance with confidence, accustomed to overwhelming weakened defenses and dispersing what remains of local authority. Egypt waits ahead of them. Ramses III has positioned his forces deliberately, infantry in the center, chariot divisions behind, and archers placed where they can shape the opening stages of the fight. The Egyptian line is compact and disciplined, formed to make use of the compressed terrain. Every soldier understands that this ground favors their methodical approach and restricts the enemy's ability to maneuver in depth. As the Sea Peoples close the distance, the Egyptians initiate the battle. Archers release the first volleys, high arcs of arrows that descend in dense patterns. The goal is not to break the enemy, but to disrupt their cohesion, to force hesitations and shield adjustments that slow the advance. The Sea Peoples raise their shields but continue forward, absorbing the impact. Dust rises around them, thickening with every step. Their momentum does not collapse, but it begins to strain. Egypt adjusts its formation fluidly. Archers withdraw behind the spearmen, passing through the intervals maintained for this purpose. The front line locks shields, spears angled forward. This transition happens with practiced precision, and by the time the Sea Peoples reach striking distance, the Egyptian infantry stands ready to meet them. The collision is immediate. The Sea Peoples drive forward with the force of a dense mass, swords swinging, shields pushing, legs braced for impact. Their fighting style emphasizes strength and aggression, seeking to break lines through pressure and individual combat. But the Egyptian formation holds. Spearmen absorb the shock, and shield bearers reinforce points where the pressure intensifies. Behind them, officers ensure the rhythm of the line remains steady. The fighting becomes a contest of endurance. At close range, the Sea Peoples excel with their long swords, capable of delivering heavy, sweeping blows. Yet they must continually fight for space, and the narrow corridor of Djahy denies them the ability to spread out. The Egyptian line, though under strain, maintains its structure. When warriors fall in front, the formation adjusts without breaking. Rotations occur in brief lulls. Tired spearmen step back, fresh ones take their place. The chariot corps moves into position. They wait not for a dramatic charge, but for the moment when pressure on the infantry line begins to stretch the Sea Peoples' formations. As the attackers attempt to widen their assault, the chariots begin their approach. The ground, firm under the rising heat, allows them to gather speed quickly. They focus not on the center, but on the exposed flanks, where the Sea Peoples' cohesion thins. Their first passes are decisive. Chariot archers fire as they move, releasing arrows into unprotected sides. The Sea Peoples shift attention toward the new threat, creating gaps along the primary front. The chariots do not press deep. Instead, they withdraw, regroup, and strike again, maintaining constant pressure. The effect is cumulative. Each pass disturbs the Sea Peoples' rhythm, forcing them to choose between sustaining their frontal assault or responding to attacks from the flank. In the center, the Sea Peoples attempt to regain momentum. They push with renewed force, clustering into tight groups to break the Egyptian line by sheer mass. The Egyptians counter by tightening their ranks, shield edges pressed against one another. Short, controlled thrusts from spears slow the enemy's advance. Archers reappear behind the spearmen, releasing volleys into concentrated targets when opportunities open. The coordinated layers of the Egyptian defense reduce the effectiveness of the attackers' heavy sword strokes. Fatigue becomes a decisive factor. The Sea Peoples have marched long distances and fought numerous engagements in recent months. Their formations, though fierce, lack the rotational structure that preserves stamina in prolonged battles. Egypt, by contrast, uses the predictability of its line to manage exhaustion. Soldiers step back in shifts, maintaining alertness across the front. Ramses' strategy aims not at sudden collapse, but at gradual erosion. The chariots strike again, this time deeper and more sustained. The momentum created by these mobile units forces the sea peoples to contract their formation to protect their sides. This narrowing disrupts their pressure at the front, allowing Egyptian spearmen to advance a few steps. Small gains accumulate into a broader shift in momentum. The sea people's initial energy begins to dissipate, and their dense mass becomes a liability. With limited room to maneuver, fallen warriors create obstacles that slow those behind them. At the height of the battle, the sea peoples attempt one final surge. They concentrate strength at a single point, hoping to break the Egyptian line and create a path through the bottleneck. The Egyptian infantry braces, spears angled, shields interlocked. The impact is heavy, but the formation absorbs it. Immediately afterward, the chariot corps sweeps along the flank again, firing downward into the compressed clusters struggling to break through. This dual pressure, front and flank, marks the turning point. The sea peoples can no longer advance, and their retreat is hindered by the very population traveling with them. They begin to yield ground unevenly. The Egyptians press forward with measured force, never overextending, maintaining cohesion as they reclaim the contested space. As the sea peoples withdraw, the battle shifts from intense contest to controlled pursuit. Egyptian forces maintain discipline, advancing steadily but avoiding the chaos of a reckless chase. The goal is not annihilation but disruption, breaking the momentum that had driven the migrating coalition southward. The sea peoples fall back in fragments, their earlier confidence replaced by the need to escape encirclement. By midday, the fighting subsides. Egypt holds the field. The sea peoples, though not destroyed, have been halted. Their advance toward the Nile Delta is broken for now. Dust settles over a battlefield marked by the contrast between Egyptian order and the disorder of a migrating force forced to retreat. The Battle of Djahy ends not with spectacle but with clarity. Egypt has proven that it can still command the tactics, logistics, and discipline required to face the forces reshaping the Mediterranean world. The sea peoples remain a threat, but their first attempt to reach Egypt through the Levant has failed. The kingdom endures, and the legacy of the Bronze Age holds for a moment longer. When the fighting at Djahy ended, the landscape carried the marks of a struggle that had tested both the resolve of Egypt and the momentum of the sea peoples. The Egyptians held the field, their formations still recognizable despite the strain of battle. It was a rare sight in an age when armies across the Mediterranean were dissolving under pressures far less direct. Djahy had become the point where the collapse of the broader world met a kingdom still capable of coordinated resistance. For the sea peoples, the outcome marked an unfamiliar reversal. Their progress across the Levant had been a chain of successes, cities overwhelmed, defensive systems bypassed, and weakened powers unable to mount meaningful opposition. Their combined movement relied on this continuity. Every victory fed morale, every new foothold added resources or allies. But at Djahy, this forward momentum broke. The narrow terrain, the discipline of Egypt's infantry, and the relentless intervention of the chariot corps split their formation and disrupted the confidence that had carried them south. Their retreat after the battle was uneven and slow. These groups did not travel light, and the presence of families, carts, and belongings made rapid withdrawal impossible. The warriors who had led the advance now had to protect a population suddenly exposed to danger. They were not annihilated, and Egypt could not have destroyed such a dispersed network in a single encounter, but they lost the initiative. The advance toward Egypt had been halted for the first time. For Egypt, the victory carried more than symbolic value. It granted time to strengthen the Delta defenses, to redistribute supplies, and to prepare for the next phase of conflict. Ramses III understood that the sea peoples were not a conventional enemy that could be defeated permanently. They were part of a wider movement created by systemic collapse. Even if scattered, they could regroup. Even if delayed, they could redirect their focus. Djahy did not end the threat, but it reshaped its trajectory. The broader Mediterranean world continued to fracture. The Hittite Empire vanished entirely. The Mycenaean kingdoms dissolved into scattered enclaves. Coastal trade networks grew thin, transforming once thriving ports into isolated settlements. Egypt's survival made the contrast even sharper, an island of order amid a region slipping into fragmentation. Yet the significance of Djahy extended beyond Egypt's borders. The battle demonstrated that structure, preparation, and discipline could resist forces born from collapse. It revealed that a state with coherent leadership and logistical depth could slow even migrations that reshaped entire regions. It marked the moment when Egypt proved that it could still impose stability, however temporary, on a world losing its equilibrium. Djahy did not save the Bronze Age, but it preserved the last of its great powers long enough to withstand the storms still gathering at its gates. In the years that followed the Battle of Djahy, the wider Mediterranean world continued its descent into fragmentation. Palatial systems disappeared from the map, trade networks contracted to narrow channels, and the familiar order that had defined the late Bronze Age became a memory rather than a living structure. Yet Egypt endured. Its survival stood in contrast to the ruins surrounding it, a final reminder that collapse, though pervasive, was not absolute. Djahy's significance lies not in the scale of destruction or in the spectacle of a dramatic triumph, but in what it preserved. The battle reaffirmed the strength of an organized state when faced with forces shaped by desperation and displacement. It demonstrated that discipline and preparation could still carve stability out of a world in motion. Egypt did not reverse the age's decline, but it resisted it long enough to maintain its identity and protect the Nile Valley from the fate that befell so many others. In this endurance, Djahy becomes more than a military encounter. It becomes a marker of resilience at the edge of an era's collapse. While kingdoms fell and networks dissolved, Egypt held its place, standing between the remnants of the old world and the uncertainty of what would follow. The storm surrounding it did not vanish, but for a moment, it met resistance strong enough to break its advance. And as the dust settled over that narrow corridor of land, Egypt remained the last steady light in a landscape of fading powers.